For those of you who don't know me, I'm Professor Rafael Vizcaino, Assistant Professor in the Department of Philosophy here at DePaul. So it is my true pleasure and honor to be here amongst those of you. Thank you again, Bill, for the kind invitation to be a part of this conversation. We're joined by three guests today, and we'll have 20 minutes for their presentations, and I'm going to introduce them one at a time. And afterwards, hopefully, we'll have up to 1 hour for Q&A. So without any further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. David Lantigua is Associate Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, where he also co-directs the Cuda Center for the Study of American Catholicism. In addition to numerous book chapters and scholarly articles, he is the author of Infidels and Empires in a New World Order, Early Modern Spanish Contributions to International Legal Thought, and co-editor with Lawrence Clayton of Bartolomé de las Casas and the Defense of Amerindian Rights, A Brief History with Documents. He is also co-author with Daryl Fashing and Del DeChant of Comparative Religious Ethics, a Narrative Approach to Global Ethics. And he'll be presenting a paper titled Being Possessed by Mammon, Idolatry, True Worship, and New World Catholicism. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Rafael, for the introduction. Thank you to the Center for World Catholicism, the Center of World Catholicism, and to Bill Kavanaugh for the invitation. Very honored and just pleasure to be here. Just such a fine company of scholars and thinkers and pastors. And also thanks to all the staff for their hospitality and making this event possible. Very grateful. The title I've taken here is an important suggestion, I feel, for what theology can contribute to this question of idolatry critique. In looking to the past, the historical past, particularly the colonial period that we're going to be talking about mostly today, we could do it in a historical way or through a postcolonial or decolonial lens, but what I think a theological lens can provide uniquely is turning to the question of spirituality. And so when the colonial period is often discussed, it often revolves around the question of how it is that Europeans claim to take possession of things, possession of people, possession of land, of property. But I'm more interested for this presentation in the question of being possessed, which is, of course, a very spiritual question, demonic, diabolical kind of question for thinking about how to look to the past. And in thinking particularly about idolatry, the question of true worship will inevitably raise itself. To begin, I want to see this entrance into the historical past through a Latin American or Ibero-American perspective. So I begin really with Pope Francis and Latin American theology and the question of secularism, because I think it offers us a unique way of looking to this topic of secularism that's come up in various presentations already. So the first thing I'd want to point out is that from the perspective of Francis, or how I read Francis, and Emilce Cuda will certainly go more into this, and we can discuss this more in her presentation, secularism is more about individualistic materialism than, say, the loss of belief in God or removal of religious images or symbols from the public space. So secularism need not be incompatible with forms of religiosity. We shouldn't see secularism and religion as being kind of polar opposites or binaries in the way that Professor Kavanaugh had kind of laid out for us. So in Evangelii Gaudium, we hear Pope Francis talk about this new self-centered paganism that's manifesting itself in our world today as an object of consideration for the church's pastoral concerns. Another thing to consider from this perspective, again, informed by a kind of Latin American theological tradition, is that secularism is not a subtraction of God from the public sphere, but rather a proliferation of gods in our public and private lives. So thinking about secularism, again, more in this kind of materialistic sense of what are the kinds of things that occupy our desires and interests and possess our decision-making as the end of our decision-making or aims of our actions. And so I have this reference here from this pioneer of Latin American liberation theology, Gustavo Gutierrez, where I think this is very compatible with something we heard earlier, again from Kavanaugh's opening remarks. In Scripture, the rejection of God is presented as idolatry rather than as atheism, and idolatry is an ongoing risk for the believer. So just a couple quick things to say about that. I mean, the first is, whereas in the global north after the Second Vatican Council, there was a great deal of attention to the question of secularism as the church's main pastoral concern, what we see in Latin America is more this attention to idolatry, right, as being the concern of the church. And you see this manifest certainly in the letters that come out of Latin America, the bishops' letters after Vatican II, Puebla, for example, which takes on the question of various idols that occupy the Latin American society. And so there's that element to bring out. The other thing is that idolatry is an ongoing risk for the believer, as Gutierrez points out. So there's this element, if we think about idolatry as the problem, Christians are going to have to face that question in their own lives. And the dominant God, of course, for Pope Francis and the Latin American theological tradition is none other than Dios Dinero for the modern age, or the money god. And so Pope Francis will often talk about money god, and we already heard it referenced to in Evangelii Gaudium, but also in other works, his meetings with the world meetings of popular movements, he'll make reference to this. And I'd also mention St. Oscar Romero as another example of somebody who really gives us insight into this money god in his struggle in El Salvador against the national security state, but also the ideology of liberal capitalism, as he would name it. So some things here to think about in terms of the contribution that I see here Francis making to this question of Mammon and how we look at the past. No one can serve two masters, of course, from Scripture, right? You cannot serve God and Mammon. Francis gives us an interpretation of this text in an address to educators in 2007 when he said, "Money is the universal measure of all things in the modern world. Everything has a price. The intrinsic value of each thing is uniformly given a number. The measure of each human being is God, not money. That is the meaning of transcendent dignity, or infinite dignity is the new document of the Vatican just put out. People cannot be counted or valued as numbers." Right, so what I want to draw attention to in thinking about Mammon then is this rich tradition of reflecting on the vice of greed or covetousness, or in Greek, pleonexia, this desire to have more and more, this endless pursuit of the accumulation of wealth. When we look to the Spanish colonial period, I mean, just going back to McCarrer's point, like, it's unbelievable what you find. It's all there. Like, you just look to the texts themselves and to the conquistadors themselves, and you find just how pervasive this greed actually is. So in looking then in the context of the New World and the conquests of the New World, I kind of draw attention here to this quote from Francisco López de Gomara, who is a chronicler, just to give you a sense of how this imaginary presents itself to the Spanish colonial mindset during this period. The most important event after the creation of the world was the discovery of the Indies. The conquest of the Indies began once the conquest of the Moors ended, and that is because it was God's will that Spaniards be always at war with infidels. So it's just to give you a sense that the way that the Spaniards understood what they were doing in spreading Christianity and evangelization, they were drawing on a tradition of crusades, of the Reconquista in the Iberian Peninsula, of taking back land from Muslims. That was all part of the mindset in seeing what they were doing in the New World, the project of what they were doing as being one of claiming land that was possessed by infidels and idolaters in particular. And so in that context, we have this idolatry critique that emerges by the first Spanish Dominicans who arrived 2 decades after Columbus first landed on the island of Hispaniola. And so we have this prophetic critique that takes place in 1511 during an Advent sermon of Anton Montesino, one of these Spanish Dominicans, of critiquing this encomienda system, which was really this transplantation of really a kind of a feudal model of governance in which workers were under the protection of a lord who would provide them with food, and in this case, in the encomienda system, catechesis. And so it was a very kind of interlocked spiritual, material, and cultural way of binding together Spaniards and taking political possession of the native peoples. But this, as the Spaniards realized quickly, was the Dominicans realized, this was utterly destructive to life on the island. And if the aim was to bring Christianity and to convert the native peoples, that is, in coming to the New World, this was obviously going completely contrary to that aim. And so you have this amazing sermon of Montesino where he stands up before this church in 1511 to these encomenderos and says, "You all are in mortal sin. You live and die in it, all by the cruel and terrible ways that you treat the native peoples, waging hideous wars against them, and you do this all for the thirst of gold." Right? So that's where we get this first real kind of critique of the idolatry of gold that they see taking place. And of course, they get a lot of backlash from that, from Columbus's son, Diego, and from others, administrators on the island. But I also want to point out there's an element of indigenous critique that's also operative here. So there's a very important figure in indigenous history that's preserved by the likes of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was recording history on these matters during this time, where Hatue, who was a native chief or cacique, he is burned at the stake because he leads this kind of revolt against the Spaniards. But he comes to identify that the Spaniards worship the god of gold. And so that critique is really important to, again, this sort of idolatry critique that's not just being presented by Spaniards, but also by the indigenous peoples themselves. And you have this incredible story of Hatue choosing rather to go to heaven, where he would spend eternity with Christians, he'd rather be in hell. And this is Las Casas' way of really kind of presenting just how deeply antithetical Christians are to the message of the gospel in the New World by a life of idolatry. The other thing I want to point out with respect to idolatry critique is, and this goes back to the point made by Gutierrez about if idolatry is really the focus here rather than atheism and thinking about unbelief, that offers the opportunity of critiquing ourselves. And that's exactly what we see in the life of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was an encomendero. So he had, in the island of Cuba, he had his own indigenous laborers, forced laborers that were under his supervision. And he undergoes this conversion experience. And it's largely through the Dominicans that he has this experience, but it's also through the reading of Scripture, which in 1514, during the Feast of Pentecost, he reads this passage from Sirach. "If one sacrifices from what has wrongfully been attained, the offering is blemished, the gifts of the lawless are not acceptable. Like one who kills a son before his father's eyes is the man who offers sacrifice from the possessions of the poor. The bread of the needy is the life of the poor. Whoever deprives them of it is a murderer. To take away a neighbor's living is to commit murder. To deprive an employee of his wages is to shed blood." So this sears the conscience of Las Casas, along with what the Dominicans are doing, which is denying absolution to anyone who's an encomendero. As you can imagine, again, how controversial they were. Las Casas begins to see just the magnitude of what he's doing and how detrimental it is, not only to the lives of the native peoples, but how detrimental it's going to be to the eternal state of his soul. Right? And so he begins to realize that he and the Spaniards have been scourging and crucifying what he says, Christ in the Indies, by attacking the natives and depriving them of life. So this association with the natives is part of the body of Christ. I can go into this more maybe during Q&A if anyone's interested, but this is also this Christological dimension is very important to Las Casas' appreciation of the native peoples through this, what we might call today, this understanding of human worth and human dignity. So who are the conquistadors? Just to give us a sense of what's happening here. I'd like to use this image of Alexander the Great because the critics of what the Spaniards were doing at this time would often say we're not to be like Alexander the Great. But this is in the mindset of the conquistadors and the historians and chroniclers who were giving records of their accounts. They very much saw what the Spaniards were doing to be in the spirit of Alexander the Great, but mixed with St. Paul, because they were spreading Christianity. So in a way, they understood themselves to be even more effective than St. Paul, because they were actually using the sword that St. Paul carries, right? Putting it to use to try to coerce the native peoples into submitting to Spaniards in order to bring about their conversion. And so what we have is the conquistador. And one of the ways that I like to think about them, using the work of Felipe Fernandez Armesto and Matthew Restall in their book on conquistadors, is to think about them as armed entrepreneurs. Because what they were doing, not just in spiritual terms, which we'll turn to in just a moment, but also in very material economic terms. And they talk about this because part of what motivates them is to receive benefits, material benefits from the trade routes and the possessions that they're taking of the native peoples. Idolatry is the key justification by which the Spanish Empire and conquistadors were able to justify the conquest of the Indies. I cannot emphasize that enough. So it's really a Spanish war against idolatry, right? We saw that passage from Felipe Lopez de Gomara, where he talks about how Christians should always be at war with infidels. So this is precisely what we see in the writings of the conquistadors themselves. They're using legal justifications, because Spain was a very legal culture, to carry out this project. So Cortes says, the principal motive and intention must be to dislodge and root out idolatry from all the natives of these regions, and to bring them, or at least desire to bring them, to salvation. For if the said war were fought with any other intent, it would be unjust. And so here what we find is reference after reference among these sympathizers of conquest to the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, to Scripture, to Deuteronomy, the taking of the Promised Land, right? That God has ordained. This is precisely how the conquistadors and their supporters are justifying the possession of native people's lands and possessions. They're idolaters. They need to be submitted to the true religion, and it's their idolatry which is seen to be a violation of the natural law, right? So this notion of idolatry being against the natural law is something that comes from the canon legal tradition that the Spanish are using in order to justify this punishment, right? Because natural law, if it's something that violates natural law, then you would suspect anyone can have jurisdiction over punishing any violators of the natural law, rather than, say, a civil or positive law. So that becomes the way that they begin to justify this conquest in areas beyond Spanish jurisdiction. And so what's interesting is that Las Casas himself is trained in canon law, so he knows this literature, and he draws on another tradition of canon law, which is the tradition of natural rights, to defend the native peoples, to defend their rights to their own possessions, to their lands, to their freedom, and even to their idolatrous possessions. But I can talk more about that during Q&A if anyone's interested. What I want to get to here now to conclude really is just the way of understanding possession here, being possessed, the spiritual thirst for gold and silver. And I want to draw on the insight here of the philosopher Zeytan Todorov in his Conquest of America, where he talks about the verb to discover in Columbus becomes intransitive, right? It's something that really has no end. So this discovery becomes this really kind of endless pursuit. And you see it in the writings of these figures, right? So Columbus will say in his journal of 1492, October 15th, these islands are very green and fertile and the breezes are very soft. And he says, and it is possible that there are in them many things of which I do not know, because I do not wish to delay in finding gold by discovering and going about many islands. And then he spiritualizes this by saying, our Lord, guide me that I may find this gold. I mean, their mind, for I have many here who say that they know it, right? So this drawing on the Christian God to help him find gold And then lastly, you have this line from Cortez to the emperor, God willing, more gold will be mined in this land alone, so many mines being discovered, than in all the islands put together, and as many more, right? Columbus couldn't go far enough in the islands. The land, though, right, terra firma, that has endless supply of gold and silver. And so that's exactly what we see in the case of Potosi, the silver mines of Potosi in Bolivia. Domingo de Santo Tomas, who was a close friend of Las Casas and helped Las Casas to critique the encomienda system, particularly in Peru, he writes in one of his letters, it must have been about 4 years ago during which this land was about to be lost, that there was discovered a mouth of hell, or boca del infierno, into which have entered, as I say, within that time, a great quantity of people, which by the greed of the Spaniards they sacrificed to their god, certain silver mines called Potosi. So this critique, this is the kind of idolatry critique that we see manifesting itself among Spanish Dominicans at this time, but also other Spanish friars and others. That's really critical to the retrieval, I think, of this history. Now, where I really kind of want to end here is thinking about the critique that Las Casas raises in Entre los Remedios, which was a very important treatise that he wrote against the encomienda system, which really I think reveals for us how it is that the love of money can be considered the root of all evil from Scripture, 1 Timothy. Right? So what Las Casas does here is he really sort of provides this critique of money as a capital vice, right? And it resembles the ultimate good, and this is why money is so dangerous. This is why it's one cannot serve God and Mammon rather than say God and the self. And here we may have more to talk about with respect to Augustine. Money is something that promises self-sufficiency, and through money, one can acquire all other temporal things. This is why money is so dangerous, right? It's more universal, he says, than concupiscence, and it has the appearance of being an end in itself and a guarantor of everything else. So money can help you acquire everything else. That's why it's so dangerous for Las Casas. And he goes on to say, and these are quotes from Entre los Remedios, the void or vacuum of a wealthy person's appetite to be wealthy can never be fulfilled in this life because the end of acquiring wealth is always endless. He says, just as the possession of gold and riches has so much similarity and proximity to beatitude and happiness, as an end, it is infinitely desirable, and thus the appetite for greed is endless. Right? So this is to have unlimited desire for wealth accumulation is to be possessed by Mammon. And this is precisely what the Dominicans are calling out, this possession by Mammon. And this is why it's diabolical. Right? So I will not go into this very much because we're out of time, but just to say there's an Aristotelian Thomistic teleology here and understanding of ethics that really informs this critique of the idol of Mammon and this distinction between natural versus artificial wealth. And again, I don't have time here to go into this much, but just to say this distinction between artificial wealth and natural wealth in Aristotle that Aquinas picks up is also used by the Spanish Dominicans as a way of recognizing that artificial wealth is not something that should be pursued for its own sake, but it's always in service to pursuing natural wealth, which would be things like that are necessary for human flourishing: food, drink, housing, clothing. So Las Casas will say about the indigenous Americans, they do not seek gold and other fine things because they do not want them. They only seek exchange to obtain the things they need, which are what nature yields. So here, drawing on the insight of Marshall Salins, that anthropologist, in his book Stone Age Economics, the original affluent society, what Las Casas recognizes is that there's a kind of affluence, a kind of flourishing, a kind of well-being that the natives have that's without excess, without luxury. And I think that connects very closely today with what Francis has been saying about this theme of buen vivir, or to live well, that you find among Latin American, but also North American indigenous cultures. I'll stop there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David, for that wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. Our next speaker will be Andrew Redden from the University of Liverpool. Andrew Redden is currently a senior lecturer in Latin American philosophy at the University of Liverpool. Yes. Is that what I said? Oh, wow. My unconscious betrays me. I could swear I said history. I'm going to check the recording later at home. His research stems from his interest in global missions and, more generally, the transmission of religious ideas and practice in the early modern period throughout the Hispanic world, as well as the conflicts and sometimes surprising accommodations that resulted. In his first book, Diabolism in Colonial Peru, 1560 to 1750, he explores the interaction between the perceived presence of demons and colonial Peru's diverse and cultural population. So, and Andrew will be presenting a paper titled Seeing Idolatry, Devotion, Divergence, and Dogma in the Latin American Colonial and Postcolonial Experience. So you have the floor.
Well, thanks so much for the introduction and also for the invitation to participate in this really interesting conference. As I was thinking what I could contribute to the conference, I was wondering how I might link my own research about colonial Hispanic America. So if we in broad periodization terms, we're talking from the 16th to the mid-18th centuries, to what's really, to me, was a surprisingly contemporary theme. Because idolatry concerns in colonial Hispanic America, from the Spanish perspective at least, tended to be almost exclusively, although not entirely exclusively, directed towards indigenous Americans as part and parcel of the campaign to evangelize the two continents. So I was thinking about this, and there was one recent idolatry-related polemic that took place in Rome, centering on the Pan-Amazonian Synod held in October 2019, that really presented a quite useful case study to bring the two periods together. So I thought, once I was thinking about this, I thought there's actually loads of lessons that we can learn from the colonial Latin American experience to help us nuance and understand or interpret what happened in the polemic of the Synod, or that came out of the Synod. So I'll start with the Synod, move to the colonial Latin American experience, and then come back to the Synod. So, okay, the Pan-Amazonian Synod of 2019 very much tied into the theme of the papal encyclical Laudato Si, and which focused on environmental degradation and humanity's duty of care for the world. And the encyclical opened with a quotation from St. Francis, which reads, "Praise be to you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces various fruit with coloured flowers and herbs." And the Synod very much reflected this theme. And as a result, it was dedicated to St. Francis, and the ceremony of dedication took place in the Vatican Gardens, and the Pope even planted a tree, a holm oak or a holly oak that was brought from Assisi during the ceremony. So once he was sat down with his cardinals around him, delegates, and they're referred to in the Synod documents as auditors, auditrici, because they don't have the voting rights in the Synod. I think it's just bishops that have the voting rights. So the delegates entered, and these are from the Amazonian region, and they come into the garden, they're singing, they're dancing, and they're a mix of indigenous and non-indigenous people in the group, as well as a Franciscan friar. And in the center of the space around which the congregation is seated is a circular embroidered cloth depicting images that are representative of the Amazon, and it's spread out on the ground. And on top of the cloth are placed various objects, and perhaps most controversially, can you see the mouse? Yeah, it's moving. So you've got figures that invoke or represent fertility, such as a carving of a naked male with an erect phallus, and two carved wooden figurines of a pregnant naked woman. And about 11 minutes in, the delegates, including those of non-indigenous heritage, and I'm using that assignation very loosely, and the Franciscan friar, they sing and they dance around the cloth and the figures, and then they kneel as an indigenous spiritual leader leads a prayer in Portuguese. The delegates then bowed down with their arms outstretched and their foreheads touching the ground, as you can see here from this still from the video. And I'll come back, we'll unpack this shortly. And this was followed by an offertory procession in which an indigenous woman presented Pope Francis with one of the carved pregnant female figurines. And as she handed the figure to the Pope, the indigenous representative declared loudly in Spanish, "This is Nuestra Señora de la Amazonía, this is Our Lady of the Amazon." And a male voice is heard responding, "Da vida de vida, giver of life." Now, there's a whole load of performative and symbolic details that relate to the ceremony that I don't have time to go into. But what I'm going to do is just focus solely on the carved female statues, because that's what the polemic really centered on as it developed. And these female statues were ceremonially processed into the Basilica of St. Peter and then processed rather than possessed, into another church, Santa Maria in Transportina, which is not too far away from St. Peter's. It's just on the banks of the River Tiber. And they're installed in a side altar. In total, there were 5. There were only 2 in the ceremony, but there were 5 in total. And these ceremonies of dedication and installation, they're filmed and they're distributed online so everyone can see what's going on. And 2 young Austrians, one who's a convert from Lutheranism, saw the ceremony online, fly to Rome. They removed the statues surreptitiously from the side chapel. They lined them up on the balustrade of Ponte Sant'Angelo, and they deliberately knocked them into the Tiber, as you can see here. And this is really impactful if you watch it on the video. I'm afraid I didn't have time to kind of do the video stuff here, but you get the impression from the stills here. And they also filmed it and distributed it on the internet. And then the leader of this operation, if that's the word for it, Alexander Zugel, he gave interviews online, and he signaled in his interviews that what they were doing was to draw attention to the idolatry that was taking place in the heart of Catholicism in the Vatican itself. Essentially, this was an act of extirpation of idolatry that they carried out. Now, in response, Pope Francis issued a formal apology via his press office for any offence that was caused by these actions. But rather than saying there wasn't any idolatry that took place, my reading of it is that the apology tacitly acknowledged Zugel's idolatry discourse and actually engaged with it by denying intention rather than action. So the exact English wording that was distributed to the press was that the statues were in Santa Maria in Transportina, and I quote, "without idolatrous intentions." And in this apology, he also directly referred to the statues as Pachamama statues. So Pachamama is a Quechua term referring to the earth goddess, the Mother Earth. And he doesn't refer to them in the apology as statues of Our Lady of the Amazon. Now, I was curious about this. I wanted to know if I could trace back, at what point does the assignation of Pachamama come into to refer to the figurines? And I couldn't trace it back further than the apology itself. So it seems to have been, I mean, I could be wrong because I couldn't get the information, but it seems to have been Pope Francis, or at least the press office, who first used the name Pachamama to describe the female statues. But at the same time, very shortly after the ceremony had taken place, and because of criticisms they were receiving from various sectors, Vatican officials very quickly started to distance themselves from the idea that this is a representation of the Virgin Mary. And they insisted instead that this is the figure of just an indigenous woman representing life, and I quote, "was neither pagan nor sacred." But the fact that the Pope named the figure as Pachamama, even if he didn't intend this to happen, actually had the opposite effect. Because symbolically, what it does is it infuses the image with a sense of pagan divinity. It elevates a representation of an indigenous woman to the status of a goddess. Even though Pope Francis doesn't believe this, how it's being received is not necessarily what's being said. So, and the key point in all this, and I really need to stress this, is that the declaration by the indigenous delegates in the ceremony that this was Our Lady of the Amazon, Giver of Life, was ignored in its totality and very quickly forgotten. So this is where I'll turn now to colonial Latin America. And it probably wouldn't surprise anyone here if I said that, in fact, there's been a long and very deliberate association of the Virgin Mary with indigenous earth goddesses and also sky goddesses. So with the earth goddesses, Pachamama is one of them. And the starkest example of this, perhaps, is this devotion here. And we're returning to Potosí, la boca del infierno, David mentioned just now, because this is a representation from Potosí of Nuestra Señora del Cerro Rico, Our Lady of the Rich Mountain. And she's called that because the mountain was at the time the richest source of silver in the Spanish Empire. And in this painting, Mary, who's richly robed as a Spanish virgin, she's crowned Queen of Heaven by the Holy Trinity, who you can see here. But what's really remarkable about this image, and others that are based on it, because there's a series of these images, is that the Virgin Mary has actually become the mountain itself. So what would be the robes, the dress and the cloak combined, take on the contours of the mountain in this triangular shape. And the trees and the veins of, you can see the trees and the veins of silver here. They're the embroidered adornments to the cloak. It's like this kind of Baroque illusion painting in some senses. And this has been studied by a very important art historian, Bolivian art historian, Teresa Gisbert, who's unfortunately no longer with us. And she's traced the Virgin Mountain imagery back to a deliberate attempt by Augustinian friars in the late 16th century to substitute the indigenous worship of mountain deities with that of Our Lady. And particularly a devotion to La Candelaria, although this isn't La Candelaria. And Teresa Gisbert dates the iconography of the Virgin Mountain between 1620 and 1720. There's quite a large margin of error there. But as she's the art historian, I'll go with her better judgment. And she argues that there's enough examples in existence to suggest that the association was relatively widespread in the region. She came across 5 of these in the series. And I'll support that because this is a photograph that I took of a copy that I came across in Santiago de Chile. It wasn't one of the 5 that Teresa Gisbert knew about. So it's even more widespread than Teresa Gisbert knew. So that's La Virgen del Cerro in Potosí. We're moving now to Oruro, which is also in Bolivia, what's now Bolivia. And there's a contemporaneous devotion. This time to La Candelaria, and this virgin is called La Virgen del Socavón. And El Socavón translates as the mine. In this context, it best translates as mine. And so, in terms of her aspect, she's in part the Virgin of the Apocalypse in the Book of Revelation, because she's standing on the crescent moon. You can just about make out the rays of the sun that are emanating from her. She's being crowned by angels. And like La Virgen del Guadalupe from Mexico, who I don't have time to go into, I really wish I did, she's wearing a cloak of the starry night, or the starry night sky. But because she's carrying the baby Jesus and she's holding a candle, so we know that she's La Candelaria. Significantly, like La Virgen del Cerro Rico de Potosí, her shrine is directly located over a silver mine. And not surprisingly then, she's a very important devotion of Bolivian miners who still pray to her for safety and for success. But if you go down into the mine, there's a very different kind of shrine. And this is to El Tío, the uncle, known colloquially and familiarly, but we would know him as Lucifer, the Prince of Darkness. And offerings of alcohol, tobacco, and coca leaves are left to El Tío at the shrine. I should mention at this point, El Socavón is no longer being mined, so this is a museum, and so it's not easy to know whether this was in that particular mine, or whether it's kind of a mock-up that demonstrates a religious tendency of the Bolivian mines. But it has been traced by Michael Tausig, amongst others, an anthropologist who's traced the kind of devotion to El Tío up to the present day. And we know also that it's still going on in the mines which are still active in Potosí. And I should also mention that devotion to despite the fact that the mine is no longer active, devotion to the Virgin of El Socavón, La Candelaria, is still really strong. So each year, the Feast of Candlemas, the 2nd of February, is celebrated with pilgrimage and festivities. So you might legitimately wonder then, does this mean that the indigenous Bolivian miners who pray to Our Lady, whether in Oruro or in Potosí, are also engaged in devil worship? It's complicated. So you can perhaps think of it, and this is my kind of this is my understanding. Think of it more like taking Jesus' advice in the New Testament to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, and unto God that which is God's. I'll unpack that a little bit. What do I mean? Well, with the discovery and appropriation of all of these silver mines, which were vast sources of wealth for the Spanish Empire, and there was also the discovery of mercury mines in Huancavelica, which is in the central Andean highlands. With the discovery of these mines and the kind of indigenous Andeans from a very wide surrounding area were subject to forced labor. They were forced to go down into those mines. This is the Boca del Infierno, as part of their tribute obligations. And as a result, they're subject to terrible, terrible working conditions, and tens, if not hundreds of thousands of indigenous people died in those mines. And this contributed to it's a significant contribution to a demographic collapse in the region. There were other factors that played into this demographic collapse, but the mines and the forced labor was part of it. Now, at the same time, in the first 16th century campaigns of evangelization in the Andean region, which is led primarily by mendicant friars, so Franciscans, Dominicans, and Augustinians, the Christian cosmovision is kind of being squeezed by the clergy into conceptual shapes from indigenous languages, so in this region, particularly Quechua and Aymara, and it's being transformed in the process. So the clergy are very keen to transfer the worship of indigenous deities to the worship of God, as you might expect, and also the veneration rather than worship, although the distinction is not very clear and not well understood then or now, of the Christian pantheon of angels and saints. Worship of God, veneration of the angels and saints, and simultaneously they're campaigning to demonize indigenous deities, and the indigenous sacred places of worship are exercised, sometimes violently, and then they're frequently appropriated for the Christian cult. And this comes from the blueprint of Pope Gregory the Great in his instructions to those who evangelized Northern Europe, and particularly Britain, the British Isles, in AD 601. This is a blueprint that the mendicant friars implemented in the Americas. But as the 16th century progressed, concerns amongst clergy became more prominent about the use of indigenous words to describe sacred Christian entities or concepts. So in the 1583 trilingual catechism, so the languages were Spanish, Quechua, Aymara, they used neologisms for Christian entities, or basically Spanish words. So Dios, meaning God, Spiritu Sancto, Holy Spirit, Virgen Sancta Maria, Holy Virgin. They're directly imposed without any translation at all, because they're worried about how they might get transformed if they were translated. But interestingly enough, spiritual places retain indigenous assignations. So heaven, for example, in Quechua, is called Hanakpacha, meaning the upper world or upper space-time. And that's distinguished from Kai Pacha, Kai meaning this, and Pacha meaning world or space-time. And we can see here a line drawing by a mixed-race Spanish indigenous chronicler, Felipe Guamán Poma de Ayala. And I show this one particularly because it strikes me as a really Augustinian influenced drawing. Not just because he calls it Ciudad del Cielo, the city of heaven, or down below, he actually says Ciudad de Dios, but because, I mean, you can just see it. Well, you can imagine the tumbleweed that's gone through it. It's like, apart from Mary and the Holy Trinity, it is completely empty. It's a very visual representation of the idea that none are saved unless God, by his gift of grace, chooses to save us. Because he says, it's the city of God and of the poor men who followed his word. Well, there's nobody there. It suggests that no one is capable of following God's word, so we can only be saved if God chooses to save us. Yeah, so that's his representation of Hanakpacha, the upper world. And you might compare it to his Ukupacha, the interior world or the lower world, which is a very classic medieval European representation of a hellmouth into which people are just physically being rammed by demons. And you've got all races represented. So you've got a Spaniard, you've got Africans, you've got indigenous people. They're just literally being shoved in, and there's no space to fit anyone else. But significantly, the term Ukupacha, the interior world, the Quechua term, is used to designate infierno, hell, in the catechisms. Guamán Poma de Ayala actually uses the term infierno here, but in the catechisms, Ukupacha is the term used by the clergy. So, the catechisms, the brief catechism, describes how those who don't believe in Jesus Christ and those who, although they have faith, do not carry out good works nor keep his law, will not be saved. Rather, they will be condemned to eternal torment in hell. And Ukupacha is the word used. But the problem is that Ukupacha, the interior world, doesn't necessarily invoke the fire, brimstone, torment, and pain that's so common to European depictions and understandings of hell. Instead, and I'll defer to Luis Millón as another historian, but he's a fluent Quechua speaker, and unfortunately I'm not. He says, it's the place and time in which the seeds and the ancestors live, the future and the past defined as not present. That is his explanation of hell. It's a place of fecundity. It's a place where despite that's where the fact that it's the place where the dead go, it's a place where new life sprouts again. So there's ambiguity here with the use of these terms. And ambiguity increases when in the catechism, the devil, named as Satan, prince of the rebel angels, is described as having been cast out of heaven, I'm quoting here, for his great pride and into Ukupacha. They use the term Ukupacha. Demons who accompany him, who are cast out of heaven with him, are banished to Ukupacha, and they're named Ángel Supai. So the Spanish word for angel, ángel, and the Quechua name Supai is the name for a particular regional mountain deity. But the problem, of course, is rather than being a materialization of absolute evil, which is what the classic European understanding of the devil is, it's an impossibility in the indigenous cosmovision. It just doesn't make sense, for absolute evil doesn't exist. So Supai, like indigenous deities across the Americas, combined and applied both destructive and creative forces and capabilities. So let's bring that back then to the two shrines in the Socavón. However closely indigenous entities and concepts mapped onto the Catholic Christian ones, there's no question in the Socavón, let's move back to the image, that the Virgin is an entity linked to Hanakpacha, the upper world space-time, because she's standing on the moon, she's emanating the sun's rays, she's cloaked in the night sky, and she's being crowned by winged beings. She is an entity associated with Hanakpacha. In the case of the Virgin of Potosi, let's move back to there, the separation's less clear because she's Pachamama, the earth goddess, the mountain itself. But Christian doctrine, as it's taught, was adamant how Satan, the prince of demons, the apple, the lord of the Ángel Supai, has been cast from Hanakpacha into Ukupacha, which is essentially the intestines of Pachamama. Apologies, we've just eaten, but And this is his dominion now. It's his dominion, and he rules there. So if they want, they have to, it's not the case of choice. If they have to extract minerals from his kingdom, then they have to ask his permission to make it worth his while. They have to ask his permission, and they have to make it worth his while through reciprocity. They can't just go in and take, because they won't come out alive. And they know this. So they offer coca and alcohol as a reciprocal gift to the being whose dominion it is that they're forced to go into. Would this have been considered idolatry by the Spanish clergy? Without a shadow of a doubt. But it's not them that's being forced to go down into Ucupachita to take out the silver. Was it done with idolatrous intention, to use the words of Pope Francis? Not really. I'd suggest this is more realpolitik, based on having interiorized what they've been taught by the very same clergy, render unto Caesar. So it's kind of like a contrast to this, no man can serve two masters. They've got to, or they'll die. So, by way of a conclusion then, let's move the slides on. The colonial indigenous experience should perhaps present a cautionary tale for those who are quick to condemn indigenous religious practices as idolatrous, and by that we can bring in those that took place in Rome in 2019 during the Pan-Amazonian Synod. Now, from a European perspective, I'm including the USA within that, and also, I suppose, Europeanized, if that's the right word to use, Latin Americans. It's hard to ignore the fact that the delegates who included a Franciscan friar, and to me that was the most surprising thing perhaps, danced around, knelt and bowed down before graven images, objects and images that don't map easily onto the traditional European iconographical aesthetic. On the other hand, there's a real problem with assuming that when truths that are held to be dogmatic and universal are translated into other languages and across cultures, that the meanings of these truths and even the nature and aesthetics of the entities associated with them must and will remain the same. That is problematic. It doesn't, because the history of evangelization in Latin America and elsewhere across the globe teaches us that it frequently doesn't remain the same. Similarly, it's also problematic to assume that ceremonies and rites that for so many years have held particular meaning within a European context can easily transfer to an indigenous American context and still be meaningful. So this raises questions then of what rites are legitimate in the worship of God and in the veneration of saints. Who can participate and lead that worship, and in what ways? Now, on the converse kind of side of things, we've got Jose Luis Ascona, the Bishop Emeritus of Marajo. He gave a sermon shortly after the Synod, in which he described what took place in the Vatican gardens as people rendering cult to the goddess of fertility in the manner of pagan Greeks who rendering cult to Artemis. And he uses that trope, the Greek trope. And he says, the participants were worshipping the Mother Earth, the Pachamama, whom he's almost shouting now, should neither be adored nor rendered cult, neither Pachamama nor the Mother Earth or the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary is completely different. And then he carries on. And they offered the Pope a pregnant woman that day, saying she was the patron of the Amazon. Lies! Our patron is Mary of Nazareth. Applause and cheers from the congregation, as you can see here. Yet since Christianity reached the Americas for nearly 500 years, the Virgin Mary has been deliberately associated with earth goddesses and also sky goddesses in order to expropriate or redirect indigenous worship. Once that translation has taken place, is it so easy to separate them? Ultimately, and this is my final point, it's worth bearing in mind that before condemning something as idolatrous, it's fundamentally important to know to whom or what entity that worship or veneration is being directed. Because after all, in his canticle, St. Francis can praise God through Mother Earth. He uses the term Mother Earth. So can those who condemn the Vatican garden ceremony be so sure that the participants are not doing something similar? Despite the strangeness of the ceremony to my eyes, at least, I don't want to speak for anyone else, but yeah, it looks strange to me, even given my academic background. The fact remains that the woman who presented the statue to Pope Francis declared, and we really shouldn't forget this is Our Lady of the Amazon, es Nuestra Señora de la Amazonía. She did not say, this is Pachamama. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for that also very thought-provoking presentation. And our last speaker, but certainly not least in this panel, is Emilce Cuda. She is the first laywoman to hold a Vatican position as Secretary of the Pontifical Commission for Latin America, appointed by Pope Francis in 2021. She is also a member of the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences and the Pontifical Academy for Life. In addition, she serves as an advisor to CELAM, the Latin American Bishops' Conference, belongs to the Global Network of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, and is in the faculty of Loyola University, Chicago. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Cuda.
Thank you so much. I think, thank you so much for this invitation to DePaul again. This was my house for a couple of years ago. Thank you so much, Bill, for inviting me, Karen, and all your team. And thank you all for my college here. I think my presentation are in relationship with my other two friends in my panel. It's not the casualty, it's the Holy Spirit, I think, no? I'm sorry about my English, it's not good. I would like to start with the video, because in my opinion, the idolatry is not the root, but the consequence. To understand the idolatry, we must understand the ideology, because the ideology produced the idolatry. And I would like to speak about how today, in the actuality, in the capitalisms, in the libertarianisms, in the actual church, appear the idolatry, and how is the face of idolatry today. So, to start, I think this video is great.
Let's take a big picture look at what's going on here. Over the next decade, 2 decades, it is expected that there will be $150 billion worth of oil and gas extracted off your coast. It's an extraordinary figure, but think of it in practical terms. That means, according to many experts, more than 2 billion tons of carbon emissions will come from your seabed, from those reserves, and be released into the atmosphere. I don't know if you, as a head of state, went to the COP in Dubai.
Let me stop you right there. Do you know that Guyana has a forest forever that is the size of England and Scotland combined? A forest that stores 19.5 gigatons of carbon? A forest that we have kept alive? A forest that we have kept alive.
Does that give you the right? Does that give you the right to release all of this carbon?
Does that give you the right to lecture us on climate change? I am going to lecture you on climate change, because we have kept this forest alive that stores 19.5 gigatons of carbon that you enjoy, that the world enjoy, that you don't pay us for, that you don't value, that you don't see a value in, that the people of Guyana has kept alive. Guess what? We have the lowest deforestation rate in the world. And guess what? Even with our greatest exploration of the oil and gas resource we have now, we will still be net zero. Guyana will still be net zero. With all our exploration, we'll still be net zero.
Powerful words, Mr. President. But
I'm not completed as yet. I am not finished as yet. I am just not finished as yet. Because this is the hypocrisy that exists in the world. The world in the last 50 years has lost 65% of all its biodiversity. We have kept our biodiversity. Are you valuing it? Are you ready to pay for it? When is the developed world going to pay for it? Or are you in the pockets? Are you in the pockets of those who have damaged the environment? Are you in the pockets, are you and your system in the pockets of those who destroyed the environment through the Industrial Revolution and now lecturing us? Are you in their pockets? Are you paid by them? Are you paid to keep their message alive?
Well, it's great, really. But the idea is, you understand what happened with our religious symbols and with our social magisterium. Because in the actuality, the ideology build an idolatry about the Pachamama, about the Amazonia, and that is an excuse to stop our people to live from the wealth that God gives to us in Latin America. That is the truth. And now we can't touch anything because the central country need to continue to produce their industrial development. We are not the problem. Latin America are not the problem. And other thing is the big business of the green bonds. Another big business. So that is idolatry. That is idolatry. That is the new phase of idolatry. And I would like to speak about that because in the root of that idolatry, we must to identify the ideology. So to continue with this Lonergan method to see, to judge or to discern and to act, I would like to present, taking in account that we are in a change of time and do a technological leap. It is this big crisis is not because a meteor crashed to the earth, no? The cause is our industrial production, our relationship in the production of our wellness. But the cause of the crisis is, of course, a technological qualitative change. So to understand idolatry, in my opinion, we must to see the confrontation between ideology and theology. Second, to discern that at the moment the chaos is at the same time the political moment. And first, how we can do, and Pope Francis called us to organize the hope. So I am going to speak about that 3 points. So, first, ideology versus theology. At the moment, we have an ideological appropriation of our religious symbol. My college speak about the Virgen de Guadalupe, Pachamama, Virgen del Cobre. In Europe, we have the Virgen de Fatima. This is now the new language behind the market, hide his face. In relationship with this, Pope Francis, in the last 2 party of Guadalupe, December 12 at the Vatican, in his homily, he said that, I need my glasses. December 12, 22, I am concerned about the ideological cultural proposal of various kings that want to appropriate the encounter of one people with its mother, that want to the mix to make up the mother. Please, let us not allow the message of the distillate into worldly and ideological guidelines. The message is simple. It is tender. I am not here your mother, and the mother is not ideological. And then 23 was absolutely simple. He only speak this paragraph. The image, the tilma, the roses. This is the messages. It is that simple, without gloss, along with the security that she is my mother, that she is here. And this message defends us from so many social and political ideology, which with this Guadalupean reality is so frequently used to justify itself and make money. The Guadalupe message does not tolerate ideologies and any king. It is just the image, the tilma, and the roses. Well, in relationship with this, we must to distinguish between false prophets and apostles. Apostles, as you know, is people who go ahead without a fear, and false prophets, like Pope Francis called them, is the people who practice the indietrismo, and go indietro, go back. No, it's an Italian. Pope Francis speak about indietrismo. Who are the false prophets? The false prophets, in relationship with Fratelli Tutti #1, the first chapter of the last encyclical, the last social encyclical of Pope Francis, they are said that false prophets are who create the need, then isolate, then sell security to that people who was isolated, and then they take the soul. That is ideology. That is the process of ideology. And on the contrary, apostles are that people who listen, dream, know who create needs, who work for unity, not isolate people, who organize the community. For Pope Francis and for Latin America theologian, or part of them, to do a theologian is this, is to build a community, is to work for the unity, is work with the people, is work for their dreams, not for their necessities. And in the chapter 2 of Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis called us to Samaritanear. But this is not easy to pronounce. He take the parabola del Samaritano and convert it in a verb. No? To Samaritanear is to imitate the Samaritano, the good Samaritan, who helped a person without ask nothing about virtues or about relations or about money or about nothing, and who put his time, who put his money, and he wasn't a religion person, because the other religion person, the theologian or the priest, pass without look at him. No, so the idea is that to be an apostle is on the contrary of to be a false prophet. But it's interesting how Pope Francis put contents in this, because the people speak about prophets, about bad prophets, about apology, but nobody put a content. Nobody said what exactly is to be an apostle today. The second moment of my presentation is the moment of the discernment. And I would like to share with you this idea that I take from other philosophers, especially people who works in the political theory, especially Chantal Mouffe. I'm sorry. And Chantal Mouffe, years ago, in a presentation, she said that the moment of the chaos is at the same time the political moment. If we think that now we are in a chaos moment because we are in a crisis, an ecological crisis, that is a social and economical crisis, and this is a chaos. Why? Because this big technological change will change everything in the history. Because this big technological change will change the relationship of production, so will change the economy, so will change the government form, of course, so will change the war, because will change the arms. And that happened in the history, in other moments, as you know, that's happened. So when the people now say, well, this is not democracy, what happened with our politics, this is corruption, well, they are thinking in the 20th century, and we are in the 21st century. And this big change is impossible that we can continue with the same form of government. They are not enough for this new moment. And we can put this in relationship, for example, with Carl Schmitt. When Carl Schmitt, if you remember the text Mar y Tierra, no? Earth and sea, maybe some of you remember that text, when he tell us that each time that technological change, the power of the world move. When the technological was on the earth, some countries or some nations or some place of the world was the owner of the world. But then when the technological change moved to the air or to the sea, or they was, for example, in what moment was important Spain, England, France, but then las potencias was United States and Russia. But now we are in a different moment where the territory of the politics move to the virtual territory because the technological change. So we must to think other forms of government. In that case, this is the moment of the chaos, but at the same time is a political moment. Why? Because the people who win this fight for ideology or idolatry will be the new God, the Deus Mortalis, no? As you know. But the first question is why, in the chaos moment, do the people always choose the extreme right? This is a good question. Because in my country, for example, in Argentina, in the moment of the chaos, in the chaos moment, the people choose the absolutely right. But they can choose the absolutely left. Why not? And that happened always in the history. And Chantal answered because at the moment of the chaos, the right is organized. Because they are class, because they are the unity, because they are a symbol. But the left, always at the moment of the chaos, is disorganized. Because the demands are disarticulate, because they are fighting for identities, because they become the diabolon. The chaos moment is a political moment. Why? Well, because at this moment start the Deus Mortalis start a campaign to arrive to the government. So why I call them Deus Mortalis? Because they try to organize the hope of the people. Because if we think that the hope is a virtual, is a theological virtue, like faith or charity, we never can lose the hope. Because we never do anything to have that. Was mercy. So the people never lost the hope. And the political know that. That is the reason why in the moment of the chaos they go to organize the hope of our people. So they promote to create a new world from nothing, like God. They present themselves like God because they, for example, they close public organisms, they close ministries, they suspend the parliament, they close industry, and the idea is to order the chaos. The idea is to order the chaos. And how to order the chaos? To create a new world from nothing. Like God, but they are not God, but they present themselves like God. They promise to create a new world from nothing. They intend to bend the popular will. Social injustice is replaced by individual sin. They convince to our people that their situation, the absolutely unjust, is because they did something wrong, so now God is castigando, no? The situation is not the injustice, is not the consequence of a social relationship. is the consequence of an individual sin. That is for example, this new model of theology of the prosperity, but it's not only, but they are between us too, of course, this idea that, for example, now you can listen to the new candidate speak that the social injustice is something that is impossible to speak about, that is something from the left, that is communism, that is Marxism, and the Pope is the representative of the evil in the earth because Pope Francis speaks about social injustice. So it's interesting because this is the real world. This happened now. You can read this in the newspaper and listen this in the candidates. So the idea to show that these people can to create everything from nothing and put them in the cell in the place of God, of course they ask to our people sacrifice. Now sacrifice, because we can see there, as she showed us how the people was in the past, no, when the conqueror came here, but now our presidents, our candidates, ask to our people sacrifice. And you can see in the video that I show you, sacrifice. Why? This man from Latin America asked to the journalists in Europe, why we must do sacrifice? If your problem, not our problem. But the idea of sacrifice is not in the past. We must to show that happened now, almost in the periphery. I don't know in your country, in the central country, but that happened in Latin America, that happened in Africa, and that happened in part of Asia too. Well, in the moment of the chaos, something happened, and this the state changed. Because if we think, where is the state? The state is where somebody, a person, a family, or a bureau take the decision about the life or the death of the people. At the moment, I am not sure if the state is in the government, if some person or some family can to buy a country. One person at the moment is tan rico, no? Is so rich that he can to buy a country. So he can to decide about the life or the death of the people. So where is the real state today? This is a big question. This is an important question, because that person asks or demands for idolatry. And that happened because we have a big ideology as support of that. And in the majority of the case is a theological foundation, huh? Because they put in the place of God. So, what Pope Francis said about this? Bueno, o nos unimos o nos hundimos, no? Pope Francis looked for the unity. If this is the situation, we must to be unity. And that moment start the moment of how to organize the Pope. Pope Francis called us to organize the Pope, because the hope, because that hope exists. But other people that are not Catholic, neither Christian, are organizing that hope and promote the people like false prophet, the life, the beauty, the wellness. And Pope Francis, no, that is our work. We must to organize the hope of our people. And in the documents of Pope Francis, they don't say what, they said how. How do that? For example, in the new constitution of the Curia Romana, Predicate Evangelium, in the first article, there that the content is not what is exactly to evangelize, what we must to say. No, the idea is how we must to do it. And this modality is touching the suffering flesh of Jesus Christ in the people. Touching the flesh of Jesus Christ in the suffering of the people. In Evangelii Gaudium, he said, exist to the periphery, health in the world, Laudato Si, taking care of the world, connecting, everything is connected. En Querida Amazonia, he called us to being outraged. He called us to reporting, to denounce, and to organize ourselves. In Fratelli Tutti, he called us to a social dialogue, to organize. In Evangelii Gaudium, Deus Mortalis versus organizing community. For example, this new model of politics that I call Deus Mortalis, in that model, ideology is more important than theology, sacrifice is more important than social justice. The new candidates don't speak with their people about social justice. In the campaign, they speak about sacrifice. This is incredible. About sacrifice. They promote sacrifice, and the people vote for that. But if you have another candidate that speak about social justice, the people don't vote for him. The people vote for the candidate that promotes sacrifice. Idolatry is more important than Eucharistic. Economy is more important than politics. But in this new model about organizing community that Pope Francis and the theology, part of the theologian promote, the reality is more important than the idea. The unit is more important than the conflict. The whole is more important than the parts, and the time is more important than the space. And in his dialogue with the African students last year, Pope Francis said that the organizations wins to the time. It's important how to organize the hope, how to organize the people for him. Ideology, in Laudato Si said, ideology is in relationship with theological political foundation. For example, when we speak about ecological crisis all the time, this crisis is only in relationship with an environmental crisis. But nobody speak about the social crisis. It's the society or the system produce a division between social crisis and environmental crisis. And the consequence are the video that I show you. In that encyclical and in other documents, for example, in the last documents, Dignitas Infinitas, 75% of the documents speak about social injustice. But all the journalists at the notes in the newspaper are about bioethic, sex, etc. But nobody speak about other topics that are present in that document. For example, extractivism, labor exploitation, human traffic, child labor, external debt of the state, extermination, organ trafficking, private prison, extreme rights, sale of arms. All those topics are part of this ecological crisis because it's a social environmental. But the ideology produces that we only put our eyes or focus on environmental crisis. So then they ask for us a sacrifice to help the Pachamama. It's crazy. Well, needs and dreams. Querida Amazonia speak about needs and dreams. If we, for example, these candidates speak about needs, so the consequences are distrust, despair, credulity, isolation, ideology. But Querida Amazonia is an exhortation that doesn't speak about needs, it speaks about dreams. If you speak about dreams, the consequences are truth, hope, fight, organization, and theology. Querida Amazonia speak about 4 dreams: social dreams, cultural dreams, ecological dreams, ecclesial dreams. But when the people present the situation from the church in Latin America, never speak about dreams. The people speak about, and theologians speak about necessities. So they repeat the other credo, el credo de la ideología. And the consequence is the idolatry. In Fratelli Tutti, in my opinion, the idea is diabolic versus symbolic. Diabolic. What is diabolic there? Is the community of individualisms. Pope Francis speaks all the time about this new individualism that is a communitarian individualism. It's a community that take you, isolate of your friends, of your family, and they take your soul. And this is the cause of the abuse, as you know. Other problem is religion unions. In the African meeting with the students, Pope Francis speak about religion unions, like work union workers. What is religion union? That individual communities that take a person like a mediation between them and God. And Pope Francis is, as we need religion unions to be in contact with God, no? And false community mystic that they offer salvation, but on the contrary, what is symbolic is an organizing community, is a missionary discipleship, is a mystical community of salvation. So the idea is to stop the idolatry, we must organize the society, because we can speak a lot about idolatry, but the idea is what we can do with that. So we can do is politics. Pope Francis is in the number 176 of Fratelli Tutti, he said the world does not work without politics. Of course, totalitarianism is politics. The Deus Mortalis offer another mode of politics, but we are looking for the best politics, and the best politics is the community organizing to themselves. I would like the other panelists when he did a question about is the democracy another form of idolatry? Because today, when persons like me speak about this, other persons accuse me that I am speaking against democracy, that is not democracy, or they'll sell democracy, but which kind of democracy? No, participant democracy or an exclusive democracy? Because at the moment the democracy is manipulated for the virtual technology, and that is a big problem too. To think that we need to think another mode to think in the democracy in the 21st century. Bueno, for that, to finish my presentation, we have ideological device and theological device. In my opinion, ideological device, to put in the situation of the idolatry, one is the technology that produce isolation, territorial reconfiguration by the language. O sea, the influencers in Ecuador come to influence in the president election in Spain, for example, because they work in the same idiom, Spain. So we must think the territory and the politics in other terms. Influencer is an ideological device. Some of them are fundamentalisms, conservatism, natural. For example, they think that the inequality is natural, and they sustain that they are not politics, but they dissimulate a political alliance. So how we can put our own influencers in the network, if that is possible, or if that is necessary? I don't know. We must to think in that. And the other ideological device is for example, all the wellness in Latin America is converted in rent and then go away in divisas. Es decir, la riqueza se convierte en renta y se fuga en divisas. No? Nothing, the big companies don't pay tax, etc., etc. But the conclusion is all the governments in Latin America are corrupt. That is a simple solution to explain the poor in Latin America. But no, we must to speak about this ideological device. And the theological device are the Catholicism, because we are a community. We have a new territorial reconfiguration by bioma, like in Latin America. And we have a social pastoral, a social doctrine of the church. That is a big instrument that we have. And sometimes for look a solution, we go to take another agenda that is not the Catholic agenda, but we have a corpus that has more than 150 years old, and we have there important things to rethink the situation. And other theological device, of course, is the community, the grace, the theological virtues, the four principles of the Catholic social teaching, and of course the idea is how to convert in the passion into community action, because this idolatry is passion in the middle of the chaos, because the people need to think to believe in something. So this is the proposal of Pope Francis, how to stop that idolatry. We must to find the way to convert that situation of suffering in that passion in organizing community. He said that in the second discourse to the popular movements in Santa Cruz de la Sierra. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cuda, for that wonderful paper as well, whose title I forgot to read is Ideology versus Theology. Pope Francis is called to cultivate hope. So now we have at least 25 minutes for Q&A. So it's not a huge chunk of time. So please just be concise with your questions, please. And we will similarly try to be concise with our answers.
Thank you very much. My question is for all of you in terms of a concern that I've had about depolarizing our world. We can start from you, Emilce. You talk about uniting. Uniting is often uniting against the idols. So the resistance to the presentation at the Vatican of something so dear to people's heart polarized the world, the Archbishop and the preaching. And recently there's one that also happened in is that Wisconsin? During Chrism Mass, and indigenous people danced to the altar, and it caused a bigger uproar. It's still ongoing. You go. So really, how can we depolarize, even as a faith community, any distinctive faith community? We are noticing these divisions. So, and then we're being asked to unite against, and that's another polarization.
Hi, okay. That's a great and difficult question because on the one hand, it raises the issue of polarization within the church, which is not the same thing as polarization in, say, just politics or in the wider society. So there's two kinds of polarizations, I think, that we have to think about here it complicates the matters. I think with respect to inside the church, I think Pope Francis offers a way of understanding the situation after Vatican II as being a polarization that revolves around how to understand the council. And that's kind of come down in kind of a traditionalist interpretation of the council versus a more progressivist. At least that's the way that it's often understood in the global north that I'm familiar with in these conversations. And I think one way for him to see a way out of that is to see the council as really moving us towards a greater commitment and option for the poor. And I think that provides him a strategy for mobilizing people wherever they are. But it will inevitably involve conflict And so the question you're raising about when you're uniting, you're obviously uniting against something. And I think that's true, but I think for him, you're not uniting against human beings. You're uniting against idols. And I think that for him, for example, when he looks to the popular movements, he looks to their mobilization revolving around a unity against Dios dinero. I mean, he's actually said that explicitly in these movements. And I think that's true. I've gone and interviewed people in some of these popular movements, and that's what I find is striking, that the people who are captive to Dios dinero, the social organizers that I've talked to who are people of faith believe that those idolaters are capable of change, that they're capable of having their hearts transformed by just having a conversation with the poor, particularly the poor migrant workers that I've interviewed. And so I think there is real hope in these communities for politics in the ways that Emilce has pointed out. But they don't identify the enemy as persons, but rather as these idols that persons worship. So that's how I would.
Well, your question is good, but every time that I receive a letter from you, it's with love, no? That is the end of your letters. So that is the answer, no? With love.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to answer, I think, as a historian, and possibly I'll be anathematized by any theologians in the room, but the idea is from the lessons that we learn from history, and this is what we teach to our students, if you give if you think that an answer to a historical question is black and white, then the chances are it's a bad answer. And it's really about looking for the nuances. It's about nuance. And that actually links to something that I think you said in your own paper about humility. It's recognizing, I suppose this is where I go a bit more theological perhaps, recognizing that we're all fallen humanity, and what we say isn't necessarily the whole of the truth. There are ultimately what people seem to be arguing about with these controversies is what is the right way to do things. People are assuming to know what other people think, and that's a problem in itself. I mean, how do you know what's going on inside people's heads? And then they're passing judgment on this and saying, once they pass judgment, and they say you've got to do it in this particular way. I mean, if you don't nuance that, then I think the answer to that is looking for the nuance. This is what we learn from all the historical lessons of missionizing. The debate about how to do things, who's being worshipped and in what way, has swung backwards and forwards between different groups of clergy. So the Franciscans and the Dominicans are often on different sides of the divide, or the Franciscans and the Jesuits, or usually the Franciscans are kind of like right in the middle of the argument. But then you get kind of more emotive responses or more emotional responses, or then there's ones that kind of move towards placing emphasis on reason. But then as soon as we start to look at what the core of the debate is, it becomes very clear that it's a question of emphasis. And so as soon as you realize that it's a question of emphasis, then the black and the white start to fall away. And so, yeah, if I had to respond to anyone that says, how can I depolarize my own opinions? Well, I said, look for the nuance. It's complicated. Life is complicated. Life is messy. Yeah, I guess that's what I'd say.
Wonderful. Thank you for those answers. Now I have been told that those of you wanting to ask questions to please do use that mic. So we have we have a list here. So we have Patrick, Victor, Bill, okay, and Stephanie. So in that order, please. And we will slide in the online one in a second as well.
So, David, more a question for you, but I'm happy to hear from everyone. It seems to me that one of the dilemmas we're facing today is, yes, it's a contention and polarization, I agree, but it's also we have incredible difficulty making any particular definition stick in a particular circumstance. So this is, I think, one of the dilemmas that like the left and the news media found in the bafflement with which their reporting did not stick to President Trump, former President Trump of the United States of America. Like they could say, well, he does this and he does this and he does this and he does this. And it was just like right off his back, right? And so I want to ask about this context that you were mentioning in your excellent paper. So two things, like, did the effort of the Dominicans to make the definition of mortal sin stick by denying forgiveness, denying penance, right, to people? Did it work, right? Did De Las Casas's effort to use natural rights as a response to natural law, did it work? Or are there constraints with like the use of the Spanish legal system to justify this? Did the efforts to bring in did it work? Like, are there lessons that we can use from this kind of effort to make a collective definition of the situation function for the kind of ends that we want to pursue? I feel like there's definitely stuff, Andrew, in your papers that are related to that. I'd love to hear it as well. So,
thank you for the question. So yeah, one thing to consider in terms of the historical context, at least with respect to the Dominicans and their speaking out against the abuses on Hispaniola that I referred to in 1511, where that was Montesino was preaching on John the Baptist being a voice crying out in the desert. He said, in the desert of this island, and that's when he appealed to the conscience of the community. So one thing to say about that is the Dominicans prayed and fasted for a year before they decided to speak out, and they did it unanimously, of course. So it took a long time, and I think sometimes people think we don't want to revert back to like a view of the episcopate and spiritual power as just a wielding of power to promote a certain political view, perhaps, right, which has been done historically throughout the church's history, right? So it's not that's not how I would see this. This is a case where the church felt like the religious community had to stand up because it was a situation of egregious injustice and gross violation of justice. So it took a long time to really make that decision. But once they did, they didn't back down. And I think that was key, is that they weren't willing to rescind, which they were told to do by the administrators of the island. And it was the next week that they came back and said, we're going to deny absolution to anyone who does not release their forced laborers, the indigenous laborers. So yeah, did it have an impact? Well, it had an impact on Las Casas, obviously, and it did have some impact on others, but what it did is that it created, to use the language of Louis Hankey, the great Latin Americanist, it was the first great struggle for justice in the New World, and I think that legacy has borne out itself in the history of Latin America, not only with Latin American independence movements and the role that these figures, particularly Las Casas, has played, but also in indigenous movements today. He's still, very often seen as an emblematic figure, an ally, if you will, to those causes. Did his appeal to natural rights work? Well, it did. I mean, actually, we talked about Querida Amazonia, Pope Francis, his letter to the Amazon. He refers to Pope Paul III in that document. And Paul III was the first pope in the church's history that came out explicitly to defend the rights and freedom of indigenous peoples. And that was a direct influence by the Dominicans. And so, yeah, I would say it had a huge impact on the universal church in that regard, and certainly an important historical legacy.
So this question for the three of you is coming from Andrew's observation on what happened in the mines in Potosí around the Tío, right? Very realpolitik in terms of when it's what they were trying to do to cover their bases. I'm asking this question because sometimes I hear similar articulations from migrants and refugees who are mindful that they also have to do a bit of realpolitik with regards to the gangs. I'm also thinking of El Salvador, right? So from someone who's worried about polarization as well, I'm also very mindful of the reality of power asymmetry and the kinds of decisions and moral agency that the kinds of decisions that limit moral agency. So how do, based from your perspectives, historically, theologically, ¿qué hacemos?
That's a really good question. There are all sorts of examples. I suppose on one side of the spectrum, you've got those who would be martyrs, and on the other, knowing that that's for very few of us we don't have the courage. I speak for myself, sorry. I don't have the courage necessarily to be a martyr. Pragmatism ends up being the only way to survive. It is a question of survival. You have to deal with what's in front of you and with whom, or with the entities that you are confronted with. So if the power, according, one of the powers is the Spanish authorities, and they're sending you down to this place of death and destruction that is the dominion of Satan, then you've got to deal with Satan as well as the Spanish authorities. So you're doing what the Spanish authorities are telling you, but in order to do that, you've got to deal with the power in question. So in that case that I mentioned, the indigenous peoples that are dealing with, I suppose, I hesitate to use the word spiritual entities. We understand them as spiritual entities, but they have a materiality that we in the modern era don't quite grasp or find it hard to grasp. So that example dealing with this situation, but there's I was thinking as I was writing this that there was a flip side to this. So in Vilcabamba, which is the last Inca state, so once the Spanish conquered the Andean region and they conquered Tahuantinsuyo, the Incas retreated into a small, very inaccessible region of the Andes and defended that small enclave until 1572. And for the most part, that was under the rule of an Inca called Titu Cusi Yupanqui, and he was an astute politician, and he allowed in 2 Augustinian friars because he was well aware of the Spanish legal jurisdiction, the legal reason or justification of a conquest, that if a prince refuses evangelization, then they can conquer. So he doesn't refuse evangelization. He allows in these friars, and he allows these 2 friars to evangelize a small sector of the population. At the same time, but he doesn't allow any lay Spaniards in. There's a Spaniard that goes in called Romero. He's a miner. He thinks that I'm the only Spaniard that's going in. I'm going to ask the Inca for permission to mine gold or to find gold. And he goes to Titu Cusi Yupanqui, and Titu Cusi Yupanqui says, "Okay, you can look, but come back to me." And so Romero goes off and he finds loads of gold, and he goes back to Titu Cusi Yupanqui, and who has him executed. He cannot let that knowledge get out, because as soon as he does, the Spaniards are going to come in and destroy Vilcabamba, because there's gold in them there hills. It seems to me it's almost like it's a human version of what the indigenous people were doing in the mines. So they go into the area, and in order to, they go into the area and they have to deal with the authorities in that area, whether they like it or not. And so they do what they have to do, and then if they can, they get out. In Romero's case, that didn't work. Yeah, so bringing it up to the situation of the gangs, again, it's a question of pragmatism. So friends of mine in El Salvador have told me about how everyone in their village at some point or another has collaborated in some way or another, even though knowing that collaboration could get them killed by the state. They still have to do it, because when they're confronted with it initially, in the immediate context, if they don't collaborate, then they could die as well. So it's a question of survival. To not do that would mean becoming a martyr, and most of us aren't ready for that, I guess.
Well, my presentation was about your ¿qué hacemos? Política. But that said Pope Francis, that said the doctrine of the Church. The first encyclical, Rerum Novarum, appeared, and the first point said, because our workers are in an injustice and horrible situation, we must help them to organize, because they have not institutions that help him behind the big capital. But in that case, the documents put the responsibility on the individual persons. But now, after 150 years, the responsibility is not over a person, it's over a system. That is a big, big, big step with Pope Francis. The enemy is not a person. The enemy, with E capital, is the system. That's a Jesuit. But it's important because at the beginning of the history, the enemy was a person, no, the owners. But now, with Pope Francis, the enemy is the system. And for that, we need unity. And the mode to get that unity is the politics, best politics. But the enemy, through the system, continue telling us that politics, what is politics? Corruption. All the politics are corrupt, especially the politicians of the poor countries. All of them are corrupt. That is not the best democracy. What? The people go to vote. No, that is not the best democracy. And they call that evangelize. And when Pope Francis said, you must do politics and to organize the hope of our people, because the evil through the system is organize the hope of our people and us then sacrifice. Because they was speaking about the past, no? But this is now in the newspaper. Go and take the newspaper or put in Google sacrifice, and you can find the actual political candidates as to the people or promote, that is worse. They promote sacrifice and the people vote for them. This is crazy. So when the Pope speak about politics, the best politics, the politics that come from down to up, Pope Francis is a communist, and all the people who repeat him too, of course, and evangelize is other thing. I don't know.
We're running out of if there's other questions. Yeah.
So we have Bill and Stephanie and an online question. I'm wondering if we should take them together. So let's take the online question and Stephanie, and probably with that we will close it.
Okay, our online question comes from Thomas Masters. He says it's more of a request, but if there's time, could the presenters, especially Dr. Cuda, connect the need for organized community with Father Gilger's conclusion yesterday that J.A.K. Smith's recommendation for thick practices as embodied in stable communities of practice?
Should we also take Stephanie's and Bill's questions just in the interest of time? And let's answer them all together. Great.
I was really struck by Andrew's presentation on the way in which the translation effort actually sort of created the idolatry problem, and how in all of also in David's presentation there was this mixing of the externally addressed idolatry of the religious other, the indigenous peoples, and the internal idolatry critique. So at this point in the conference, I just wanted to ask about that. So we've got kind of both going here, right? Instances where idolatry critique is directed outwards towards the other and often very negative ways, and then the internal critique of our own idols. So like, would you all agree with a proposition like, let's put a moratorium on idolatry critiques against non-Christians, and yet the internal critiques of the sort of prophetic Jeremiah critique of Israel kind of model is still useful? What do you think of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So are we going to take more? Or
Bill, would you like to?
No? Okay. Yeah. So do we want to take the online question first? No. Okay. So yeah, I mean, that's a great question. If I had more time to get into that, I would have done that in my presentation to think more about how it was that Las Casas and these Dominicans viewed the religious practices of the indigenous peoples. I didn't really get into that at all. And I think that Las Casas has a very kind of nuanced way to build on this very important terminology here by Dr. Redden of approaching that kind of idolatry, is to say, what he does that I think is quite brilliant is he compares the Greco-Roman forms of idolatry with the indigenous forms of idolatry that he's attentive to. For example, something like human sacrifice, which I don't think anyone would promote as something that we would say is a form of idolatry that we don't want to critique. So I would say external critique could be useful still, very much so, especially when it violates the order of justice in fundamental ways, right? But what he recognizes is that the kinds of idolatry that were characteristic of the indigenous cultures, such as human sacrifice, are meant to perpetuate the city-state. And so that kind of, and that one could critique that anthropologically or historically, whatever. But his point there is that that's different from the kinds of Greco-Roman idolatry that Christianity emerged from, right? And which he argues oftentimes had a very kind of concupiscence and all kinds of lusts and passions were very much driving those kinds of forms of idolatry, Bacchus and whatever rituals we might think of in the Greco-Roman world. So that's his way of just sort of complicating the question and saying, like, is this form of idolatry actually something that might be promoting the good of the people? And that would be one way of distinguishing kind of better and worse forms of idolatry.
I think that the people who did the question can do the relationship. No? It's easy.
So with that, please join me in thanking our speakers.